All right. Hello, and welcome to the Society for One Place Studies June 2014 Hangout. I'm Tessa Keogh. I'm a member of the Society, and I'm also the editor of the Society newsletters, which is called Destinations. I'll be at the tech controls today and turning this over to Janet in just a moment, but two things I wanted to mention. The first is that we have already published the June edition of Destinations, and that's on the Society website, and you can find it there. And I wanted to point out that in September is when we next publish Destinations. So if any of you watching today or watching the archive version are interested in submitting an article or have an event that you'd like us to put on our calendar, or just want to be more involved in the newsletter, go ahead and contact me. My email is listed in the newsletter, but contact me or anyone else in the Society and we can get you in the right direction for an article. And the kinds of articles that we're interested in are really varied. So if you're doing your one-place study and you're focusing on a particular set of records, that would be something of interest. If you're following along with the Shared Endeavor, which is the World War I project that we're working on that Alex is in charge of, and you want to talk about how you're working your study in that regard, that would be another great article. Also, if you have been publishing in any variety of sources, whether you publish in a newsletter, you publish online with a website, or you blog about your one-place study, that would be another interesting thing. One of the ones that I'm hoping to get from Alex in the near future is the changes that she made to her website. And if you haven't had a chance to go on and check it out, I believe it's Winging It. Is that correct?
No, it is wing-ops.org.uk.
All right, and then your blog is Winging It. Is that correct? Okay. So Alex really revamped her website recently, and I thought it was quite impressive, and also has a number of records that you might want to take a look at and then say, oh, I could apply this to my one-place study, wherever it is. And so I would really encourage you to take a look at the studies that people have online, as well as the studies that are located at our website. So with that, I am going to be turning the controls over to Janet Few, and she is going to discuss all things related to marriages, marriage research, marriage records for our one-place studies. So let me pin you. And you're on, Janet.
Right, well, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who's here in the room or listening in, either as we do this or in the future. What we're going to do today is to try and talk about some marriage records, the way we might use marriage records in our one-place studies. And I've deliberately tried to keep it as applicable as I can to everybody. So we're not going to home in on any one particular region, and hopefully all the ideas we have to share today are going to be useful to most people in their one-place studies. So if you're looking at marriages, and let's be truthful, marriage records are often one of the very first things that somebody who's doing a one-place study will turn to. But what you need to do is be very aware of what the customs and legislation are in your place, and we'll be talking about that. We're going to be talking about marriage venues, and then the records, and then finally, and most importantly perhaps, how all this marriage data might be used to give you a greater understanding of what's been going on in your place. So we'll start at the top with the customs and legislation. Really, you need to know who could marry, and that means what are the minimum ages for marriage in your place at various points in time. For example, a lot of people are surprised to know that in the United Kingdom, or certainly in England and Wales, the minimum ages for marriage were 12 for girls and 14 for boys, and that doesn't change until as recently as 1929. So it was quite unusual to marry as young as that. That actually was the law until less than 100 years ago. But this isn't going to be the same for everybody, so you need to be aware of what it is for your place. You also need to know who is not allowed to marry whom, and here I'm thinking of the old deceased wife's sister syndrome, and there are certain relatives that it's not prohibited for people to marry. And then there are forbidden partnerships, which is not quite the same thing. There are partnerships that are forbidden by law. In other words, most places, in most cultures, and at most times, you cannot marry somebody who's already married, unless that marriage has been dissolved. Until recently, you couldn't marry someone of the same gender. So that's where I'm going with that one. But there are also partnerships that are forbidden by social convention, and these are very much harder to pin down. Is it acceptable to marry someone from a different religion or a different national background or even a different social class? And obviously there's no hard and fast rules to this, but you get a sense perhaps of how likely this might have been in your place, and maybe even of some sense of the disapproval there might have been if those marriages did take place. You also have to be aware of when people can marry, and this is going to vary with the date, with the community, and also with the particular denomination or faith that you're thinking about. There are at times restrictions to the time of day in which you can marry, the day of the week on which you can marry, and even the time of year. I recently came across an almanac for 1642 which specified that in that year in England you were not allowed to marry between the 27th of November and the 13th of January, or the 6th of February and the 18th of April, or the 16th of May and the 5th of June. So these are quite large chunks of time when marriages were not acceptable. You also need to be aware of what the ceremony involves, and it's likely to involve all or some of the following: some form of service, either religious or a civil service, an exchange of promises, maybe exchanging gifts, perhaps exchanging rings, maybe wearing something particularly smart, some form of party afterwards, and most importantly for one-place studies, making some form of written records. Now, different dates, different places, and different venues within those places are not necessarily going to involve all these things, but you need to be aware of what might have taken place. And more importantly, you need to know how this changes over time and how it changes as the cultural mix of your place changes. It's also important to be aware of changes in the law that affect marriage in your place. There are certain key dates in different areas when marriage legislation and often the records that result changes. So in Scotland, perhaps you'll think of the year 1855 when civil registration came in. In Ireland, it's 1864. In England and Wales, it's 1837. And there is also a noticeable change in the record keeping in 1754. In New South Wales, you might say that the key date was 1788, or in Ontario, 1869. I should say here, if it's not already obvious, that my expertise is with UK records. So if you live in Ontario and you think, what is she talking about when she says 1869, this is my impression, and please correct me if you feel I'm incorrect on that matter. So once you've got the basics behind the law that relates to marriage in your place, have a look at where people could marry. And the first thing that normally comes to mind is some kind of religious building, maybe a church or a chapel, but also, of course, a synagogue or a temple or a mosque or any other religious building that you might like to name. There are also, of course, civil offices or courthouses or register offices where a non-religious ceremony might take place. And increasingly, in recent years, there are a whole vast range of private venues. Now, in some places, these are still specific venues. In other places, in some countries, you can basically get married anywhere that you can persuade a celebrant to turn up. And they are therefore impossible to document from a one-place point of view. However, one would like to hope that in your place, at least, there is a central repository for the records, even if they could have got married on the top of a cliff or on a boat or wherever. Perhaps you might like to try and map the wedding venues in your place at various points in time. Something to think about. And then most importantly for us as researchers is the records. You need to know what they are, the civil records, perhaps marriage certificates, and again this is going to vary depending on where your place is. The religious records, there may be marriage registers, and again, you need to think of the different types of denomination that might be involved in your place. And then there are associated records, so perhaps marriage licenses, marriage contracts, banns. These are all not marriage records in themselves, but records that go with a marriage. For example, if you manage to get hold of a Quaker marriage record, it normally will list everybody who's present as the witnesses. And I have seen some where it actually says how they're related to the bride and groom as well, which is a wonderful document. If you're looking at the Jewish faith, then there will be the marriage contracts. So bear in mind not just the marriage record itself, but the records that go with it. And you need to know what information you are going to find in those records. Be particularly concerned about what is in the original record, because frequently, and particularly if you live at a distance from your place, you might not be looking at the original record, you might be looking at a transcript or an index. And very often those only transcribe or index the key information, or what they perceive to be the key information. So perhaps there will be no mention of marriage witnesses, for example, in the transcript or the index that you're looking at. But you need to know that if you went back to the original record, always a desirable thing, of course, that there would be more information that perhaps you're not seeing in the record in the form that you're looking at it. You then, of course, need to know how you can access those records, and jurisdictions are going to vary with nations, because some countries keep nationwide civil records, but others will be in smaller units, maybe a state or a province or a district, and you need to know who had jurisdiction in your place. And in all cases for a one-place study, you need to be able to access the records you need for just your one small place, and this can often be a problem because the jurisdiction might cover a whole large number of small places, and the way in which those records are kept and indexed might make it next to impossible for you to identify which of those records actually relate to people who lived in your place. And increasingly, and particularly in more recent years, people who live in your place may marry outside it. And again, they are people who are quite difficult to trace sometimes, depending on how the records are organised. Religious records might be completely separate from, or in some places and at some dates, duplicates of the civil records. Are they still with the congregation? Are they held locally? Are they held further afield? Are you going to be able to access them online? If your place allows marriages in these random venues that are neither a civil nor a religious building, how on earth are these recorded, and how can you find out about those? So, as I've already mentioned, think beyond marriage records, and now I'm going to records that are really nothing to do with marriage itself, but they may give you information that a marriage did actually take place, maybe a death certificate. Now, in some countries, a death certificate records the marriage of the person who has just died, assuming the informant had that information to record it. In some countries, birth certificates of children record the marriage of their parents. There might be newspaper reports that will give you information about marriages that took place, or census returns that at least will tell you perhaps how long a couple has been married, even if you haven't got any more specific information. And what about things like wills mentioning I leave everything to my wife? That is evidence that a marriage has taken place. And then, of course, there are records of divorce. Not exactly marriages of marriage records, but at least, again, evidence that there's been a marriage, even if it has now been dissolved. And those are often, in most places, they're going to be court records. Now the important bit, how you're going to use this data. And I've just come up with a few ways in which marriage data may be used. And we're going to look at these one at a time. So first of all, marriage horizons then. And what I mean by this is, how far do people come into your place to marry? So what's the catchment area for spouses, for the people who live in your place? And it may be that you've got enough information and enough records to work out how far people who leave your place go in order to get married. And in order to do this, you need records that will give you the abode of the bride and groom. Now, obviously, this isn't always ideal because in some societies it is cheaper. For example, if you're getting married by bands, it's cheaper if bands are only called in one place instead of two. Therefore, you might pretend to be living in the same place when in fact you aren't. But unfortunately, none of these records are perfect for any of these projects. We have to do the best we can with what's available. You need to know how many brides and grooms in a particular period live in the place where they're marrying, and then perhaps who is the outsider. Traditionally, we think of people marrying in the parish of the bride, although frequently they then go and live in the parish of the groom if that's somewhere different. That's logical. Historically, the groom is the one with the earning capacity. You are therefore going to move where his job is, and it's much more likely that if one of them has got to move, it's going to be the bride. And then another mapping opportunity, how far have they come? And is it the brides or the grooms who are likely to travel the furthest? And then if you've got records for a nice long time span, does this change over time? And then what factors could lead to those changes? Are there transport links that make it more likely that your incoming spouses will come from the west rather than the east? Or is there suddenly a railway appearing in your place which means that your spouses are going to come from a lot further away? Now, another thing you might like to do with your marriage data is look at how old your spouses are. And of course, in order to do that, you've got to have a record that gives the age of the couple. And sadly, often marriage records say something inconvenient like of full age or underage for above and below, say, 21. If you're willing to do a lot of work, and particularly if you've got a fairly small one-place study, it may be that you're actually looking at the biographies of all your inhabitants. And in that case, even if the marriage record doesn't tell you how old they were when they married, you might have another record, perhaps a census or a birth or a baptism for those people. So you do know how old they were, even if the marriage record itself doesn't actually tell you. So then when you've got that, you can find out what the ages of the brides and grooms are, and which is the elder. Traditionally, it's the male, and again, you have to remember that because of that, women might alter their age slightly. Again, it's a case for looking at other records and seeing if they're consistent. Does the likely age at marriage change over the decades and over the centuries? I'm just giving you brief starter ideas here. This is not everything you need to know in order to do these projects. This is just to whet your appetite. Something else you might like to look at may be social class and marriage. Now, in order to do this, you need records of occupations of the groom and the bride, or more particularly their fathers. Now, the reason for looking at the fathers rather than the couple themselves, there's two really. First of all, the bride will rarely have an occupation until comparatively recently, and it's not a good idea to compare the groom's occupation with the bride's father because he's at a different stage of life. So ideally, you want to be able to compare the occupations of the fathers of the bride and the groom. And the next thing you need is something that will associate an occupation with a social class. And the most well-known measure of this is the list by Mr. Armstrong, who has come up with a wonderful correlation between most common occupations and one of 5 social classes, where class 1 is the gentry and class 5 is the lowest of the low. And then you can look at if the fathers and see if they're of a similar social class, how likely is it that they're of different classes, and who has married beneath them. And again, do the number of interclass marriages change over time? Incidentally, there will be lists of references and suggested reading and things. I will put it up as a couple of slides at the end, but we'll make sure that that's available to everybody after this Hangout is finished. Another thing you might like to look at is the time of year that people get married. Now, if you're going to do this, remember that a few minutes ago I was talking about there being prohibited times of year. So bear that in mind. And obviously, for this, you really just need the date that the marriage took place. And then you can see if one month of the year is more popular than another. I would suspect, for example, in a rural community that you would find few marriages during the harvest season because people were far too busy. But maybe I'd be wrong. See what it's like in your place. And again, as the years go by, does the emphasis on a certain time of year change at all? Now, something else that marriage records are frequently used for in academic research and other research is as an indicator of literacy. It's not a perfect indicator. There's an awful lot of difference between somebody who can write their name at the bottom of a marriage certificate and someone who is fully literate in the true sense of the word. But it is a good enough indicator to compare what's going on in your place over time and to compare your place with another place. So if you've got a rural area, you might want to see if it's different in a town or vice versa. For this, obviously, you need original marriage records that include a signature or indeed a cross. And then you can look at the number of brides and grooms who have the apparent ability to sign their names. And then to look at, again, changes over time. Is there a link to improvements in education? Not just the date at which education becomes compulsory in your place, but also maybe the advent of a nonconformist Sunday school that is suddenly encouraging people to write, although to be honest they were more keen on people reading than writing. But do bear in mind that this is not a perfect indicator of the number of people who were fluent readers and writers in your place. There's an enormous amount of literature on this subject if you do want to take an interest in it and want to take this further. And there are some other ideas, just if this isn't enough. You might look at incidents of second marriage in your place. And how does that affect age? How does that affect marriage horizons? And does it mean if it's a second marriage, you are more or less likely to marry out of your class? In a multicultural area, or an area that's experienced a great deal of immigration from different ethnic groups, how likely is it that marriages will be between someone of the same national background? Or indeed of the same quite specific regional background? One of the things that I take an interest in is emigration from the southwest of England to Canada. And it is surprising, or maybe it isn't, how many of the people, once they've emigrated to Canada, are marrying someone else who has come from a really quite small geographical area in their home country. And these are often people who perhaps wouldn't have known each other personally because one has been born in Canada and another has emigrated as an adult, although their families, of course, may have been in contact. What about wedding photos? I've shown a few as we've gone through this presentation. Would it be possible to try and collect wedding photos for marriages that have taken place in your place? For this, you clearly need to have a very good relationship with your place, possibly even be living in it, because it's something where you've got to badger people at regular intervals to try and part with copies of their photographs. So I'm going to pass you over the team were now. These are some of the references that I've come up with, and as I say, we'll make sure there's a full list of those where you can study those now later on. And perhaps somebody would like to tell me how they collate marriage data, what data they collate, maybe how they arrange it, store it, and analyse it. And I'm going to unscreen share myself so you can actually see me and leave you to start chatting.
Okay. So Janet will be back in a minute as she unscreen shares herself. That is a lot of information in a short amount of time. The thing that I found, I'll just go through a couple of comments that I had. Although I'm not in the place that I study, I've made a real plan to go through and take a look at the online newspapers that are from that area. And what I find is, certainly the obituaries are there, but also a lot of the marriage announcements, birth announcements, so you can find that couple when they mention the parents. So newspapers could also be a real handy thing to look at if you're trying to get either historical or even current marriage information. A lot of times in those types of announcements, they're listing the family members, so it helps you put together that entire family. One of the things you mentioned that I found real interesting, and we always have to remind ourselves, is when we're looking at something, we immediately assume that it's the original. I don't know why. We look online and we should know better, but we look at something and say, oh, this is the whole record. And something that I found out when I went up to Newfoundland to be looking at my place was the census records that were online that had been, they said transcribed, but they had basically been indexed, and they'd taken only 5 pieces of information and put it online, and there were 20 questions that gave you a lot more information. So that's one thing to really take a look at. If you're looking at an index, is it a complete one, or are they just getting that key information? And then always try to get back to the source. I know in the United States, something that's really helpful, United States and Canada, is to go to Family Search or to go to Ancestry.com and to try and see the scanned image. A lot more are coming on, but that's only the tip of the iceberg, as we keep being told. You mentioned Mr. Armstrong. That
Yes.
might be something you all are familiar with. I'm not familiar with that at all. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
He is a sort of historical demographer. Quite well known in the United Kingdom, certainly, and I know a number of people who are doing one place studies did a course with the Open University called Family and Community History, and he had quite a lot of input into that. So he did a particular study of the our 1851 census of Preston, which is one of our northern industrial towns, and he used this data for that. So it's part of quantitative research, I suppose, but you'll find that a lot of people academic researchers will use his plan as a basis for looking at social class in all sorts of contexts. But I will give
that's something I hadn't. Yeah, that was something I hadn't even thought of. But that's actually very interesting.
No, I'll make sure the links are there. That it's
Sure.
appeared in textbooks and journals and all sorts. So. But when you were talking about sorry, Karis,
go ahead.
When you were talking about newspapers, what I've found is often the marriage isn't in there, but the golden wedding is, or the silver wedding, and then you've got Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so have been married for 50 years, and you think, and of course things like family Bibles. The trouble with family Bibles is that if the first child comes rather inconveniently too quickly after the marriage, it tends to say 1830 blob instead of the correct year. But again, it's another source. But again, you're only going to get one marriage, perhaps, from that document. So it's the hard way to find the marriages.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed that when I was doing my research, Plate Cove is a very, very small community, and 2 things really entered into finding the marriage records. The first is that there wasn't a church in Plate Cove, and even in the closest community there wasn't a church. They had to go all the way to Kings Cove to be married, at least in the Catholic Church. And then even when they got married in Kings Cove, that church came later, so people went to St. John's, or else they just had their marriages blessed when the priest came to the community, as he did twice a year, to check out marriages and births, because he came to these small communities and they just went to 3 in a row when it was springtime and when they could get through on boats. And so you saw, at first I was seeing all these marriages at 2 times of the year, and I thought, what's going on here? And that was when the priest was there. But at the earlier ones, I had to go back to the Kings Cove records, and that's where everyone was listed as being married, even though they didn't live in Kings Cove. So a lot of times you have to look to those adjoining communities, as you mentioned. And my question to you would be, Newfoundland is a much different situation because, of how late things came into it, and just how outlying communities, for the most part, were there. In the UK, did you have to get married in the place that you lived or an adjoining community, or could you get married in London even if you weren't from there? What were the rules like?
It depends how you get married. If you get married by banns, then at least one of the party is supposed to have established some kind of residence. And I mean, this has gone on until the 21st century, some of these rules and regulations. So at least one of you is supposed to live there. Now, they may have lived there for 3 weeks, but at least one of you is supposed to live there. If you get married by license, there is more, dare I say it, license. as to where you get married. And then we also have these what are known as irregular marriages. So the stereotype is everyone rushing up to Gretna Green to get married in Scotland, because Scottish law is different. But there are also what we call fleet marriages, and the Fleet is a prison in London, and basically all these unlicensed priests or just strange chaps who thought they could make a few pounds out of it would marry virtually anybody, and some of the records have survived. The legality of those marriages is, another matter. But what a lot of people don't realise about English and Welsh marriage is that until we had a civil system in 1837, the only marriages that were recognised by law were those that took place in the Church of England, a Quaker meeting house, or a Jewish synagogue. So none of the Catholic marriages were recognised, none of the nonconformist Protestant marriages were recognised unless they took place in the Church of England. And pretty much that's where you had to go. And that doesn't change till 1837.
And I noticed that when I was looking at the early records in Newfoundland, that was the same thing. They would get married in the Catholic Church, but they would also get married in the recognized church, because it was just two reasons. It was required, and the second reason was a lot of times they married in their own community in the Catholic Church, but they married in St. John's in the recognized church, and then most people weren't aware they were Catholic. So the persecution in that regard had continued on, and it was just easier to go along, to get along. Where you mentioned 1837, so that's the civil registration starts taking place, and that's an easy thing to start working with, even if you're not physically there, by taking a look perhaps maybe at freebirthmarriagedeath.org.
Yeah,
is that something to start with?
The difficulty with that is that it's organised by registration district, which is huge, a huge geographical area, and no one in their right mind would be doing a one-place study for a whole registration district. So my local registration district is Bideford, which is massive and goes way beyond the actual town of Bideford. That's the big town, but it includes all the villages surrounding. So there is no way, well, I say there is no way. It's very difficult to work out which of those marriages took place in your place, because it just is Bideford.
Although I do understand from taking a look at it that once you have a registration district, you can do a search. One of the items that it will return is where they got married, actually. Because I've been finding.
Not specifically, no.
Okay.
There is a way of sort of telling using the reference numbers.
Okay.
But it's a bit inexact, because what happened when the records went from the individual churches to the registrar, they always copied them up in the same order. So parish A was always the first in the book, then parish B, then parish C, and so on for about 40 different churches. And then there was the civil ones as well. So you can sort of tell, because your little place will always be a high number or a low number, but it is quite difficult to be precise. And this is the difficulty, which is why often in a UK marriage data collection exercise, you would possibly start for the period between 1754, which is when the records become a little bit more detailed and certainly have a standard form, and 1837. Because once you get 1837, you've got things like civil marriages. So people will be going out of your little tiny place to the nearest big town for that civil marriage, and you'll lose them.
Okay.
So often we start with that middle period with our marriages.
Okay. Now, Alex, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what you might be thinking of, there are certain places where family history societies have worked on the registration districts and have put in extra information so you can tell where people married specifically.
Okay. Now, Alex, have you found your marriage information when you go visit Wing, or are you able to do that long distance?
No, all done long distance. The marriage registers have been filmed by family history centres, and we can access those microfilm here. So I do have a batch from 1837 to I think about 1870 something, 1880. I've actually got copies of all those marriage entries, although transcribing them is a big task, unfortunately. Particularly when I do transcriptions, I like to transcribe every piece of data on there. I'm not interested in a partial index. Which is what you picked up on earlier. Sometimes you're looking at indexes, you're not aware that there's additional information. So for anything I do for my one-place study and put online, it needs to be as complete as possible, and that makes it a time-consuming exercise. But I've been able to access that from here. So.
And with your wing study, just in roundabout numbers, what is the number of marriages that you're looking at and potential time frames when you say that you have a lot of records to go through?
Oh, it's
just a round number. Less than 100, 1,000?
Oh no, yeah, lots. Probably it will be up into the thousands.
Oh,
I would think. Yeah, there's a lot.
Okay. And that's one of those things to be taking a look at when you're doing your place study. And I know you had, both of you had mentioned it before, picking a place and making sure that you have your boundaries right so that you're not taking on more than you can, maybe enjoyably get through. Now, does Wing have how many churches?
There's the main church, All Saints. There have been various Methodist chapels and independent chapels over time. I don't have access to marriages that have taken place in there at all. So.
All right. So if somebody is watching from Wing and they could work on church records for you are those considered, what's the term you all use? And I don't even know if this is right. Nonconformist, what are those marriages?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So that's all those. Yeah. Anything other than Church of England, basically. Yeah. It's nonconformist.
Okay. That's what I thought it was, but I wasn't 100% sure, and I thought, okay, I'll have to ask you about that. And then this is a good opportunity since it's a hangout and it's going to be archived, and we'll put a tag in there for Wing and maybe encourage people who are in Wing to give you some other church information.
Yeah, definitely. I also wanted to pick up on one topic, and that is people from your place getting married outside your place. Because I've definitely found quite a lot of examples of those. I have a page on my website with a list of marriage strays. So those people that one or both parties were from Wing but got married in other places. And there's probably a couple of hundred. Okay. The biggest chunk came from parish records that were transcribed and published by Phillimores for churches in Buckinghamshire. Those were available on CD and those. So I just did a search through from Wing and then took out all those.
And was that something that the people, is that an adjoining community? I'm not familiar with your place at all, but why were they getting married somewhere else?
Most of them are because the other party was from that place. So the majority of them are men from Wing who have then gone and married a woman. But there are definitely ones where both parties were from Wing and then trotted off to get married for reasons unknown, although I do have an example which I can tell you about now where I know why they probably went trotting off to get married elsewhere. And that's actually one that isn't listed on my website, I just see. It's one from my own family tree. I have a couple that went down and married in London. And I was only able to be sure that I had the right marriage in the first place because I have their daughter's birth certificate, and that gave her mother's name as Mother Sarah Lathwell, late Lathwell, formerly Hardwick, meaning she was born a Hardwick, married a Lathwell, and is now married another Lathwell. And it was, in fact, she married one Lathwell man, he died. She then decided to marry his brother, which was not strictly legal. So they have gone down to London and married there, gave both residences as a local, both their residences on the marriage certificate I'm guessing it was a boarding house or something in that parish, and they obviously trotted down for the 3 weeks or just lied about where they were living and got married down there, where no one would draw attention to the fact it wasn't strictly legal what they were up to.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So there's sort of nothing on that certificate to tell me that they were from Wing at all, except I happen to know that these names and surnames and the father's names and surnames all tie up to the families that I'm looking for, so I'm positive it is the right entry. And something like that is very difficult to find.
Okay. Interesting. I had one, it's not in my one place study, but it's the same type of thing that you look for. I was trying to find this marriage because the people had the 2 children and the rest of it. I had heard that his first wife had died. That was, somebody had told me, and that he had these, a child by the first marriage. And what it was he divorced, and I'm sure that was not approved of, but he divorced in the county next to them. That's where the court record is, and he married in the other county. So you would have just assumed that was a first marriage, or they were the married couple. And once you go to the adjoining county, you find out, oh, there's a divorce and there's the second marriage. And I don't think they ever referred to the fact that there was a second marriage, the first person just didn't exist or something, or as they said, oh, she died. And I thought, oh no, she's living 2 counties away. So it's very interesting what I think Janet mentioned too. You have these premature babies that are, 8 and 10 pounds. And I had that on another one where I was looking for a marriage certificate, and I left the time frame, open 2 years on either side, and sure enough, they were married about 6 months, when their first child arrived. But it's listed in every book that I've seen as the year before, and that's another real common one. But I was going to mention that in the church records, I found in the church records, at least in Plate Cove, the priest was keeping track of so many things. So, you have baptism records, the marriage records, the burial records. And one of the things in my own grandfather's record was the priest had written in, because you had to find out that the person was baptized in order to marry them in the Catholic Church. So my grandfather was baptized in Newfoundland, but had, left and gone to the United States and was getting married in Alaska, and they sent the letter to get the confirmation of baptism. And so he noted it right on the top of the baptism index, who he married, where he married, and then there's a reference to his death as well. So those priests are always keeping track of their flock no matter where they go to, which I thought was kind of interesting, because it followed him to Alaska and it followed him to the state of Washington as well. So I find the church records, at least the Catholic Church records, very useful for monitoring them. So Janet, any other tips, or do you want to talk a little bit about how you do your own one place study? And I think you're somewhere in Devon, correct? I know your discussion was everywhere, but if you want to focus a little bit on your, how you've put together your marriage information, that might be helpful to all of us.
Yes, well, I've actually got 3 one-place studies, and each one of them has problems of its own. The first one, which is a very tiny little hamlet, until 1862, was actually divided between 2 parishes, and in England, the church unit historically tends to be the parish. So each parish has its church. If you live in that parish, you get married normally in that parish church, or at least one of the couple gets married in their parish church. So although I've got a very small place, all my early records, they're marrying in one of these other 2 churches. And unfortunately, often it doesn't tell me that they were living in my little place, because my little place is within these parishes. So I can't identify which of the marriages are mine. So that's one particular problem. But it is, fortunately, a very, very small place, and I have lots of other information, and it's small enough for me to have actually studied every individual in there in some depth, so that helps. The place where I actually live is one of those where, again, it's a parish, so there is one Church of England church, but there has been 5 non-conformist chapels of 3 different denominations, all within that area. And the records for those are, well, anything from extremely patchy to non-existent. So again, I've got a problem with that I can pick up the ones that got married in the Church of England quite nicely, but not the others. And then, of course, as you come more recently, and more people are getting married in the register office from 1837 onwards, again, quite difficult to pick those up unless you're following people through on an individual basis, which of course is partly what I'm trying to do, but I haven't quite got there with that one yet. But I am trying to record all the marriages that took place here and all the marriages of people from my place that took place elsewhere, and that's the hardest bit really. And then I do ultimately want to do things with the marriage data, like some of the things that I've suggested, and I have done some of that for my smallest of my two smallest of my three places. But it does involve having a comparatively small place to be able to go into the great depth that I've been able to do with following these people once they leave the place and where they're getting married when they've gone somewhere else and so on. So it really, that's one of the beauty of one place studies really, is that no two places are the same, and certainly the techniques you can use for a bigger place are not necessarily going to be the ones you're going to use for a very small place. And it's just swings and roundabouts really. But I like Alex, I want all the information. I don't just want the date and the name of the bride and the name of the groom. I want to know if they're single or widowed or hopefully not married already. I want to know if there's witnesses. I want to know where they were living, and frequently a lot of these indexes don't give you any of that.
And I will say that when I was finding all of the witness information, I was usually finding if the bride was very young, a lot of times a witness was one of her parents. But if they were both of legal age, it was usually a sibling of each of them. And so that was another way for me that was very helpful to connect them up with families. And a lot of times, certainly with the records I was looking at, they were listing who their parents were. So it was kind of that thing that put it into focus for you, how to get that family connected, because otherwise it's real difficult, I think, taking a look at a directory or maybe a voting list, especially for me, because they're all naming their kids the same 8 saints' names, so that made it a little tougher. There wasn't a lot of individuality there, but that was real interesting to look at. And then, for my purposes, most of them are all fishermen. They're somehow working in that fishing industry. And so what I found interesting that you had mentioned is to take a look when marriages take place. In addition to only having the priest available at certain times of the year, they were out working most of the time, whether that was fishing or the seal hunts. And so they took off kind of that Christmas, New Year's time frame when the weather was so bad that they weren't out, and they were working on nets and stuff. And that seemed to be another big time for weddings. And then, you had all the marriages taking place then because they were already having their Christmas parties. So it was a good way to have your festivities, and have it probably be cost effective, I guess. So it's interesting to kind of see how that all plays together.
I mean, I've been doing... Sorry, Alex, carry on.
Oh, I was just going to say, on the topic of marriage witnesses, that's something that, as a one-place study, easier for you to pick up and see who the professional marriage witnesses were versus who were likely to be family or friends. And I've also seen quite a lot of cases of the two marriage witnesses subsequently marrying each other. So often one may have been a sibling of the bride or groom, and it was obviously their sweetheart was the other witness, and then they married a year or two later. So,
I mean, and that's the beauty of looking at an original record. I mean, I've been doing family history long enough to have been doing it before computers, or certainly before most people had computers at any rate. And in the days when you actually looked at a whole document, you got a feel for things like who were the professional witnesses, probably the parish clerk who was witnessing every other marriage because there was nobody else about or nobody available. And you also get things like, certainly in our records from 1754, as I said, there's a standard form, but from 1837, the church records mirror our civil marriage certificates. So we get fathers listed, and you'll notice that sometimes there'll be, and you get this whether it's the church record or the civil record, it'll say the father's name and it'll have deceased in brackets underneath it. Now, you can usually reckon if it says deceased, they were, but some people who fill the forms in don't bother to put that. So if you're looking at a whole series of marriage records filled in by the same person, you can see whether they're the sort of person who puts it in if they're deceased or not. Because otherwise, if you've got two names and there's no deceased there, you don't know whether they're still alive or whether it's just this particular person doesn't bother to note if the fathers are dead. But of course, nowadays we don't look at whole records like that. We just look at the little bit that we're interested in or that we brought up by pressing a button on Ancestry or Find My Past or one of those. And you're not getting a feel for the way that record has been put together. And I think we do lose by that. But
one place studies don't, because we have context.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I definitely think that that's one of those things that when you first start out, maybe doing your genealogy, you're gathering that information and you're not really paying attention to the fact that I do think there needs to be that introductory, pay attention to this. They always tell you start with yourself, work backwards or whatever, and that's all well and good, but they need to be saying, do more than the index. Realize it's an index, go back and try and find that record. And there's a lot of records that are being scanned, so it'll help you get started or at least help you see the difference between an index and an original record that's been scanned. Now, are you able to contact the church, whichever church it is, and ask to see their records? Is that something that's common in the UK, or do you rely on if they've been filmed and given to, and I don't know how this works, but our records have to go to the archdioceses in addition to being held by the local church. And then I know for a while Family Search came in, whoever they are, came in and recorded them, but there was a bit of a falling out. So, you're able usually to get to the archdioceses to look at records, or the basilica if you're not able to get to the local church. Does that work for your UK church records?
Not really. Our church records now, in 1974, they brought in some legislation which basically said unless you're keeping your records in very prescribed conditions, a certain humidity and all this kind of thing, and except for the register you're actually still using, they must all be sent in, and they would go to county record offices. So this is a civil institution, and they had to be deposited. Now, of course, in a small
one
place,
quick question, Janet. Your church records go to a county office?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, they do.
Okay.
Because they were set up initially to house court records, but because they got the right conditions to hold these, that was designated in 1974 as the place where they should all go. And most of them did as they were told. Not all of them, but most of them did as they were told. You do find sometimes, if it's a very small parish and there haven't been many marriages, that there will still be a register that's 100 years old, but most of them are sort of 20, 30 years old, and anything older than that will have been deposited. So going to the congregations themselves is not a lot of use here.
Okay.
You would have to go to the county record office if you wanted to see the real original record, if they let you, which they probably won't, because they're only going to give you some microfilm. There were copies, not of comparatively recent records, and they're called bishop's transcripts. And in that case, whoever was making the marriage record kept one record in with the church, and this is Church of England again, and the other went to the bishop. And so where one has been lost, sometimes the other survives. And the other misconception is that the parish register, the one that stayed in the parish, was the original, and the one that was sent to the bishop was the copy, because sometimes they did it the other way around. And they made the copy at the time, they made the record at the time on a piece of paper which they sent to the bishop, and before they sent it off they copied it all up neatly into their nice register that you think is the original, and making a few mistakes and swapping a few names over and missing a few out on the way. So it's always worth, if both sets of records survive, checking both, because sometimes they don't quite agree.
That's a really useful comment, because I know that they did that with the King's Cove records. They sent them to the Basilica. They also photocopied them for the archives, and I think one page is off a little, and when you look at the original, you can tell that it's off. But at first, I was thinking, why these aren't the couples that got married? You know, it's just. And then once you look at it and you see that the line is off, you can figure it out. But if you were just looking, someone indexed it and did it completely, you know, wrong at the beginning. So that's another good reason why we have to go look at the originals. It's interesting, because I know in Italy, you're going to be finding the oldest church records are at the church, and you need to go to the priest and you need to, you know, ask to see them. And so it's really useful, depending on where your place is, to find out how they keep those records, because I never would have thought church records would go to a county, but it kind of makes sense. It's along the same lines as Sweden. You know, the church was the government in a certain extent, or at least they were together. And so, you know, all of those marriage records are actually government records as well. All right. Any other comments or suggestions to people who are going to be working on their marriage records for their one-place study, either Alex or Janet?
Other than prepared to be settled in for the long haul, because each marriage entry takes a long time to transcribe, and you have to transcribe a decent set before you can do anything with them from a statistics point of view. So there was a lot of interesting ideas that Janet put up there. It's like, a lot of work to do before you can get to that point, unfortunately.
Okay.
And I guess you don't have to do them all.
And a quick question I would ask you, Alex, in that regard is, when you transcribe your records, what are you doing, or where are you putting them? What kind of software are you using? Do you use a database, or what do you do?
Yeah, I transcribe into Excel, and then convert that Excel table into a format that can go on the website. Marriages are awfully tricky, because in your tabular form, obviously your table is very, 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 very wide, too big for the site, you know, a web screen. So that slows the whole thing down, which is why I don't have a lot of marriage transcripts on the website at the moment.
Now, do you put on, and I guess I'd have to go back and look, but I would suggest to everyone that they go look at Alex's website, but do you put an index up at all and then say you have more information, or what are you doing?
No, I haven't done that. I just assume that anyone that is interested in Wing will contact me, of course, and then I might have some more information behind the scenes, because there's always in the scenes that either isn't online yet or that you can't put online for various reasons.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't have anything explicit up there in relation to marriages saying, oh, marriages are really hard, so just get in touch with me offline. Yeah,
right.
I probably.
Although one thing I'm thinking of is when I look at the Irish census that is on, I think it's through the archives now, or however that they have both of them, they have a little bit of information. It's maybe 4 pieces of information, and then you can click for full information, and it opens up the spreadsheet. I would be thinking about it, because I haven't put any on yet, but I would be thinking of having just some of the basic information, not clicking so they could see more information, but saying, you know, my Excel spreadsheet has all of this information, and contact me for the remainder of it. And that way you might get their attention and get them to come and give you some information.
I would like to share the whole thing online if I could, because I believe that context is important. But it's just the practicalities of those large tables.
Right. No, I've seen a couple where people have them and they go off the page, and you're just scrolling over, and it's really hard to keep track of.
It is difficult, and marriages are where you see it most commonly. Even census, which also has quite a lot of detail, it's not nearly as much as a marriage entry does. So. Okay.
All right. Interesting. Janet, do you have any tips or suggestions on how people can put this information together? You know, are you using a word processing, a spreadsheet? You know, what are you doing with it?
Yes, mine's in Excel as well, although I have to say that my very first marriage records were on a piece of paper, because they were done such a long time ago. I mean, I think we've given an awful lot of information tonight. What I don't want is somebody to think, I could never do that, I couldn't do all that, it takes too long, therefore I can't do a one-place study. Because you don't have to do all of it, you don't even have to do any of it really, but I suspect the baseline is you are going to collect some sort of marriage data. It's just the beauty of the one-place study that you can take a little aspect that interests you in particular, and you can run with it. It might be marriage records, it might not. It might be something I've said, it might be everything I've said. But you don't have to do all this overnight. It's a long-term project. Now, as Alex said, you need to be in it for the long haul, and be selective and just do the bits that suit you, or just live a very long time, I think.
And I would also guess that if you are someone who scans information or takes the JPEGs, that's another way that you can share that. Maybe you don't transcribe everything. Maybe you have an image for people to look at, depending on how you set up your website. So there's a number of different ways you can approach this. And I would say having some information there, so that you're sharing names, of people in your community, and that draws the attention. If you've written a blog post about it, that draws the attention of people who Google themselves. That's how I usually get people. I put on anniversaries and birthdays each week on my blog, and I will have people contact me because they happen to Google themselves, and they might share their name with their grandfather or something like that, and then they want to know more, or they're willing to share information with you. So, even putting little pieces out there, or just getting started and knowing you have the information is useful. And I would agree. I am so not far into my one-place study, but it just was gathering information, and then it's the process of sitting down with what you got and going through everything. Because I was only going to be in Newfoundland for a short time, so I needed to physically get the information, and then I can work with it. So I have plenty of information to keep me busy for years as I plow through it. So I guess I would just say then that this, we got a couple comments already saying that it was very interesting, and it has reminded people to dig out their marriage licenses and all of the documents around it. People were real interested to find out the other things they could look at to find out about the marriages. So that was a really good list. As Janet mentioned, we're going to have a post on the blog that's at the website, and we will go ahead and post that one slide even, so that you can see the books and some of the resources that Janet mentioned. That'll be a quick way of seeing it. It will also, obviously be in this video, and you can stop it if you want to and take a screenshot of that. I think you'll have your blog post up within the week. Is that?
Hope so, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We try to have it by the following Friday, so that you have the link to the video as well as any other comments that we have, or suggestions, or additional resources. And I'd also like to encourage people, if you know about the resources in your place for marriages, that's something that you can add as a comment to Janet's blog post. So if you could speak a little bit to Italian records, or Scandinavian records, or Irish records, or anything else, be sure to go ahead and share that information with the rest of us, because even if it might not be in our place, it will give us some ideas about what we might want to look for. So I'm going to let you close this out, Janet. Any final tips, suggestions, or a little bit of advice?
Good luck, I think, really. But as Tessa said, do let us know. Do share what you're doing. Maybe tell us what you're doing, and we'll put it in an article in Destinations if you want to go to town and tell us in detail. Because this is what this is all about. There is no one right way, and we like to know what everybody's ideas are, and then we can share them and take from them what we would find useful for our place. So thank you for watching with us, and see you all next month.
All right, and if I recall, next month is Alex's presentation or discussion. I believe. Can you remind us what the topic is?
Your place.
Okay, visiting your place. So you're going to tell us a little bit about your visits and visits in general, how to prepare for them, what to do while you're there, and then how to gather that information and do something with it after the fact, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next month with Alex's presentation on visiting your place.